The Adventures of Chatterer the Red Squirrel by Thornton W. Burgess. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jude Summers. Chapter 16. Chatterer has a pleasant surprise. Chatterer the Red Squirrel, the mischief maker of the Green Forest, had never been more comfortable in his life. No matter how rough Brother North Wind roared across the Green Meadows and through the Green Forest, piling the snow in great drifts, he couldn't send so much as one tiny shiver through the red coat of Chatterer. And always right at hand was plenty to eat, corn and nuts and other good things such as Chatterer loves. No, he had never been so comfortable in all his life. But he wasn't happy, not truly happy. You see, he was in prison, and no matter how nice a prison may be, no one can be truly happy there. Since he had been a prisoner, Chatterer had learned to think very differently of Farmer Brown's boy from what he used to think. In fact, he and Farmer Brown's boy had become very good friends, for Farmer Brown's boy was always very gentle and always brought him something good to eat. "He isn't at all like what I had thought," said Chatterer, "and if I were free I wouldn't be afraid of him at all. I'd like to tell some of the other little Green Forest people about him. If only—" Chatterer didn't finish. Instead, a great lump filled his throat. You see, he was thinking of the Green Forest and the old orchard, and how he used to race through the tree tops and along the stone wall. Half the fun in life had been in running and jumping, and now there wasn't room in this little prison to stretch his legs. If only he could run as hard as ever he knew how, once in a while, he felt that his prison wouldn't be quite so hard to put up with. That very afternoon, while Chatterer was taking a nap in his bed in the hollow stump, something was slipped over his little round doorway, and Chatterer awoke in a terrible fright to find himself a prisoner inside his hollow stump. There was nothing he could do about it but just lie there in his bed and shake with fright and wonder what dreadful thing was going to happen next. He could hear Farmer Brown's boy very busy about something in his cage. After a long, long time, his little round doorway let in the light once more. The door had been opened. At first Chatterer didn't dare go out, but he heard the soft little whistle with which Farmer Brown's boy always called him when he had something especially nice for him to eat, so at last he peeped out. There on the floor of the cage were some of the nicest nuts. Chatterer came out at once. Then his sharp eyes discovered something else. It was a queer-looking thing made of wire at one end of his cage. Chatterer looked at it with great suspicion. Could this be a new kind of trap? But what would a trap be doing here when he was already a prisoner? He ate all the nuts, all the time watching this new queer-looking thing. It seemed harmless enough. He went a little nearer. Finally, he hopped into it. It moved. Of course that frightened him, and he started to run up. But he didn't go up. No, sir, he didn't go up. You see, he was in a wire wheel, and as he ran, the wheel went around. Chatterer was terribly frightened, and the faster he tried to run, the faster the wheel went around. Finally he had to stop, because he was out of breath and too tired to run another step. When he stopped, the wheel stopped. Little by little, Chatterer began to understand. Farmer Brown's boy had made that wheel to give him a chance to run all he wanted to and whenever he wanted to. When he understood this, Chatterer was nearly happy as he could be in a prison. It was such a pleasant surprise. He would race and race in it until he just had to stop for breath. Farmer Brown's boy looked on and laughed to see how much happier he had made Chatterer. Chapter 17. Sammy Jay's Sharp Eyes. Everybody knows that Sammy Jay has sharp eyes. In fact, there are very few of the little forest people whose eyes are as sharp as Sammy's. That is because he uses them so much. A long time ago he found out that the more he used his eyes, the sharper they became. And so there are very few minutes when Sammy is awake that he isn't trying to see something. He is always looking. That is the reason he always knows so much about what is going on in the Green Forest and on the Green Meadows. Now, of course, Chatterer the Red Squirrel couldn't disappear without being missed, particularly by Sammy Jay. And, of course, Sammy couldn't miss Chatterer and not wonder what had become of him. At first, Sammy thought that Chatterer was hiding, but after peeking and peering and watching in the old orchard for a few days, he was forced to think that either Chatterer had once more moved or else that something had happened to him. "Perhaps Shadow the Weasel has caught him after all," thought Sammy, and straightway flew to a certain place in the Green Forest where he might find Shadow the Weasel. Sure enough, Shadow was there. Now, of course, it wouldn't do to ask right out if Shadow had caught Chatterer, and Sammy was smart enough to know it. "Chatterer the Red Squirrel sends his respects and hopes you are enjoying your hunt for him," called Sammy. Shadow looked up at Sammy, and anger blazed in his little red eyes. "You tell Chatterer that I'll get him," snarled Shadow. Sammy's eyes sparkled with mischief. He had made Shadow angry, and he had found out what he had wanted to know. He was sure that Shadow had not caught Chatterer. "But what can have become of him?" thought Sammy. "I've got no love for him, but just the same I miss him. I really must find out. Yes, sir, I really must." So every minute that he could spare, Sammy Jay spent trying to find Chatterer. He asked every one he met if they had seen Chatterer. He peeked and peered into every hollow and hiding place he could think of. But look as he would and ask as he would, he could find no trace of Chatterer. At last he happened to think of Farmer Brown's corn crib. Could it be that Chatterer had moved over there, or had come to some dreadful end there? Very early the next morning Sammy flew over to the corn crib. He looked it all over with his sharp eyes and listened for sounds of Chatterer inside, but not a sound could he hear. Then he remembered the hole under the edge of the roof through which Chatterer used to go in and out. Sammy hurried to look at it. It was closed by a stout board nailed across it. Then Sammy knew that Farmer Brown's boy had found it. "He's killed Chatterer, that's what he's done!" cried Sammy, and flew over to the old orchard filled with sad thoughts. He meant to wait until Farmer Brown's boy came out and then tell him what he thought of him. After that he would fly through the Green Forest and over the Green Meadows to spread the sad news. After a while the door of the farmhouse opened, and Farmer Brown's boy stepped out. Sammy had his mouth open to scream when his sharp eyes saw something queer. Farmer Brown's boy had a queer-looking box in his arms, which he put on a shelf where the sun would shine on it. It looked to Sammy as if something moved inside that box. He forgot to scream and say the bad things he had planned to say. He waited until Farmer Brown's boy had gone to the barn. Then Sammy flew where he could look right into the queer box. There was Chatterer the Squirrel! Chapter 18. Chatterer is made fun of. "Ha ha ha ha! Oh, smarty caught at last!" Sammy Jay fairly shrieked with glee as he peered down from the top of an apple tree at Chatterer in the cage Farmer Brown's boy had made for him. Sammy was so relieved to think that Chatterer was not dead, and he was so tickled to think that Chatterer, who always thought himself so smart, should have been caught, that he just had to torment Chatterer by laughing at him and saying mean things to him, until Chatterer lost his temper and said things back quite in the old way. This tickled Sammy more than ever, for it sounded so exactly like Chatterer when he had been a free little imp of mischief in the Green Forest, that Sammy felt sure that Chatterer had nothing the matter with him. But he couldn't stop very long to make fun of poor Chatterer. In the first place, Farmer Brown's boy had put his head out the barn door to see what all the fuss was about. In the second place, Sammy fairly ached all over to spread the news through the Green Forest and over the Green Meadows. You know he is a great gossip. And this was such unusual news. Sammy knew very well that no one would believe him. He knew that they just couldn't believe that smart Mr. Chatterer had really been caught. And no one did believe it. "All right," Sammy would reply. "It doesn't make the least bit of difference in the world to me whether you believe it or not. You can go up to Farmer Brown's house and see him in prison yourself, just as I did." So late that afternoon, when all was quiet around the farmyard, Chatterer saw something very familiar behind the old stone wall at the edge of the old orchard. It bobbed up and then dropped out of sight again. Then it bobbed up again, only to drop out of sight just as quickly. "It looks to me very much as if Peter Rabbit is over there and feeling very nervous," said Chatterer to himself. And then he called sharply, just as when he was free in the Green Forest. Right away Peter's head bobbed up for all the world like a jack-in-the-box, and this time it stayed up. Peter's eyes were round with surprise as he stared across at Chatterer's prison. "Oh, it's true!" gasped Peter, as if it were as hard work to believe his own eyes as it was to believe Sammy Jay. "I must go right away and see what can be done to get Chatterer out of trouble." And then, because it was broad daylight, and he really didn't dare stay another minute, Peter waved good-bye to Chatterer and started for the Green Forest as fast as his long legs could take him. A little later, who should appear peeping over the stone wall but Reddy Fox? It seemed very bold of Reddy, but really it wasn't nearly as bold as it seemed. You see, Reddy knew that Farmer Brown's boy and Bowser the Hound were over in the Old Pasture and that he had nothing to fear. He grinned at Chatterer in the most provoking way. It made Chatterer angry just to see him. "Smarty, smarty, Mr. Smarty, glad to see you looking hearty. Weather's fine as you can see. Won't you take a walk with me?" So said Reddy Fox, knowing all the time that Chatterer couldn't take a walk with anyone. At first Chatterer scolded and called Reddy all the bad names he could think of, but after a little he didn't feel so much like scolding. In fact, he didn't half hear the mean things Reddy Fox said to him. You see, it was coming over him more and more that nothing could take the place of freedom. He had a comfortable home, plenty to eat, and was safe from every harm. But he was a prisoner, and having these visitors made him realize it more than ever. Something very like tears filled his eyes, and he crept into his hollow stump, where he couldn't see or be seen. End of section 6.